All right, everybody. This is topic 2.2, which is a video about something called ecosystem services. So, I want to talk a little bit today about just different things that ecosystems provide. This kind of goes along with our topic of biodiversity. The more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more of these services are provided by the ecosystem. So I want to kind of make that correlation between biodiversity and these services that are actually that we can acquire from an ecosystem. So to start off here, I just want to kind of define, I guess, what an ecosystem service is. It says here it's the many and varied benefits that humans gain from the natural environment and from properly functioning ecosystems. So I think the key word there is a properly functioning ecosystem. If the ecosystems are functioning properly, then we'll be able to obtain a variety of different services from these ecosystems. Now, these services kind of fall into four different categories. We call them cultural, provisioning, regulating, and supporting. I'm going to talk quite a bit about these today. I'm going to kind of give you some examples of each one. A few of these are a little bit bigger than others, but they're all extremely important. So we'll start off with the cultural services. These are sort of non-material things. For example, just recreation. Recreation is not really a material thing that you can go and buy. Just the fact that you can go out into nature and ride your bike and fish. I mean, I guess you can ride your bike, I don't know, in the middle of a parking lot, but I mean, would it be a lot cooler if you can like ride it with, mountain scenery around you and a lot of nature just, right there, that you can kind of appreciate. So, I mean, if we don't have properly functioning ecosystems, we can't really obtain those things. So that's kind of an important thing. Recreation and gives us mental and physical health as well. That feels a lot better, I suppose, if you've ever done it. Just kind of go for a walk, go for I don't know, go for a hike or something in a natural area, maybe near a lake or maybe near some woods or something, and you'll probably feel a lot better after you do it. I know I always feel a lot better after I do things like that. Tourism. Tourism is another thing that we, I suppose, kind of take for granted sometimes, especially something called ecotourism. Ecotourism, people pay a lot of money, every year to go and observe the polar bears in their natural habitat, or go whale watching, or whatever. I mean, people go scuba diving at a coral reef. That there's a lot of money, a lot of economics involved in that type of thing. And if our ecosystems aren't functioning properly, then we lose that, right? So tourism is a big cultural service that's provided, I suppose, by properly functioning ecosystems. Aesthetic appreciation, an inspiration for culture, art, and design. Two words: Bob Ross. If you know who Bob Ross is, and if you don't, go and YouTube him, then you'll probably understand what this means to have an aesthetic appreciation and inspiration for culture, art, and design. Okay, so that's kind of, yeah, go ahead and YouTube him if you want to. And finally, a spiritual experience. I mean, I don't know, this one's kind of hard, I guess, to kind of explain in words to you, but I mean, we have, whole groups of people who base their entire culture, on nature and ecosystems. I mean, let's take the Native Americans, for example. So, again, these are things that ecosystems can provide, cultural things. All right, now the next one is called provisioning. Provisioning services are basically just material things that we can obtain from an ecosystem. I mean, a great example is food, right? I mean, we can obtain fish from the ocean, or grains, from planting plants on land, whatever. I mean, berries, whatever. These are all things that we can obtain from a properly functioning ecosystem. So that's a pretty big provisioning resource is food. Some more things: raw materials, things like firewood, lumber to build furniture or to build houses. We can even obtain things like ethanol, which is a type of fuel, that can be used in vehicles. We get that from corn, for example. So again, raw materials are a provisioning service. Fresh water. Medicine. We can obtain medicine from a properly functioning ecosystem. I mean, I showed that video a couple of weeks ago about the tropical rainforests of Brazil, and there was that TED talk, by that one guy who was talking about all the medicines and things that we can obtain from the tropics. And if we lose that stuff, then we lose that provisioning resource. Regulating resource. This is probably the biggest one I want to talk about today. Regulating services are a lot of times kind of invisible. Like you don't like know they're happening, but they are happening. And when an ecosystem doesn't function properly, these services kind of disappear, and we notice them when they disappear. Trust me, we notice them then. But usually by that point, it's kind of too late, and we have to spend a lot of money in order to fix the damage that's already been done. A really good example of this is air quality. One thing that plants do, and maybe people don't know this, but plants actually filter the air. Like in a forested area, for example, if there's any air pollution in the area, a lot of times the plant life, especially the leaves of the plants, they'll actually filter and regulate the air quality. So they'll actually remove pollutants from the atmosphere and store those pollutants in their leaf structure. That just kind of helps us clean the air. Here's an interesting statistic down here. It says air pollution kills more people each year around the globe than AIDS and malaria combined. Air pollution is also a main contributor to lung cancer and other respiratory diseases. So, I mean, if we want cleaner air, we don't have to go spending a bunch of money. We can just plant a bunch of trees, I suppose, and that would probably help out a little bit. But we are tearing down trees at a much faster rate than we're replanting them. So that's a big problem. Carbon sequestration and storage. We've talked about this before, right? Forests are a big sink. When it comes to carbon, they pull carbon out of the air and they store it. Especially a type of forest called an old growth forest. Old growth forests are basically forests that have been untouched by people, for thousands of years, whatever. So they store a lot of carbon. They've been storing it up for centuries. All of a sudden, we go in there and tear it down, in one day, and we destroy the forest's ability to store that carbon. So we notice that when global warming happens and we got too much CO2 building up in the atmosphere, and now all of a sudden, it seems like every political debate that you watch on TV, there's going to be discussion about carbon emissions and global warming. And one of the things that we can do to kind of stop that or slow it down is we can stop the destruction of so many forests, especially these old growth forests, because of their ability to store and sequester carbon. Another example is something called moderation of extreme events. This is something that ecosystems provide that we don't really think too much about. But here's a really good example in this picture down here. Here we have the ocean. Let's say that this is out of the Pacific or the Atlantic or whatever. Um, and this is like the mainland over here, kind of like the shoreline. But you'll notice, between the mainland and kind of the open ocean out here, you've got a couple of different ecosystems and habitats. You've got the mangroves, which are basically trees that grow in the very shallow areas of the ocean, like up towards the shore. You've also got coral reefs out here, a little bit further out. They're in fairly shallow water. But all of these waves coming in from the ocean, before they reach the mainland, they're kind of blocked, by the coral reefs. They kind of add an area of protection, and also these mangroves tend to block all of that wave action and all that storm surge. So imagine, for example, if there's a hurricane, blowing, 100-mile-an-hour winds and blowing all this storm surge, up towards the mainland. Well, these mangroves and this coral reef will actually act to slow down, how, not really slow down, but it'll kind of block how much of that storm surge will affect the mainland. Well, if we tear those mangroves down, or if we destroy the coral reefs, or the coral dies and they're not there, I mean, think of the impact that's going to have on the mainland over here. the next time that there is a hurricane or some kind of a huge storm surge. We're actually seeing this quite a bit, because we're destroying so much of those habitats around the coast. We're seeing that hurricanes are having a much bigger impact, not necessarily because they're stronger hurricanes than we've ever seen before, but the ability of these ecosystems just is kind of diminishing, when it comes to moderating those extreme events and how much they can actually impact what we have going on land here, like housing developments and whatever. So, I mean, those impacts are becoming much greater. Wastewater treatment. We talked about this briefly with wetlands, right? We said that wetlands have an ability to kind of filter water. There's a lot of bacteria living down here in these soils. So any water that kind of filters down here through the, through the just through the land and eventually makes its way into the wetland will actually filter out a lot of those pollutants. So in this way, it kind of acts as a way to clean water. So if this isn't functioning properly, or if we remove those wetlands, then we'll remove their abilities to do that. And then we have a big water pollution problem. Think about how much money that would take to clean up if we didn't have this wetland to kind of do its job. Another really good example of a regulating service is soil fertility or soil or erosion prevention. All has to do with soil. And here's a really good picture here. This kind of shows us the surface, all the soil and all the plants that are growing in that soil. Let's just take this big tree here, for example. This tree's got some very deep roots that might go down 7, 8, maybe 10 feet. Even some smaller plants like some bushes and shrubs and some grasses, they all have their roots that may go down maybe only a couple inches or maybe a foot or so. But those roots have a function, besides pulling nutrients out and provide nutrients for the plants. They actually hold the soil in place. So if the ecosystem is healthy, all these trees and grasses and bushes are all surviving and doing what they do, we have a nice diversity there, then their ability to hold on to that soil is going to be very great. And that'll help reduce any type of erosion. It'll keep the soil nice and fertile so things can continue to grow there. But again, if the ecosystem is disrupted, if we come in and tear down the trees and build a Walmart or whatever we do, then that ecosystem service is no longer provided. So what can happen is the soil can become much less fertile. It won't be able to grow anything in it anymore. A lot of the soil may blow away in the wind. If that happens, that's called desertification. It actually causes a desert to occur or desert-like conditions. So that would be bad. But again, this is just the effects that all this vegetation has on the soil. It helps to minimize those impacts. So that would be a good thing to keep intact. Pollination. If you have a healthy ecosystem, then you've got a nice diversity of pollinators. These are insects or birds, or in some cases mammals like bats, that can spread pollen from one plant to the next. If that occurs, then you've got an ecosystem that can kind of manage itself, right? If we don't have those pollinators, or something happens to them because we've introduced a pesticide or some chemicals that have killed off a lot of those pollinators, then it becomes much more difficult for those plants to reproduce. So it's really good to have a nice, healthy, diverse selection of pollinators in an ecosystem. And again, if those aren't there, then that service is not provided. Um, Biological control. This one here it's a little bit similar to pollination, but this is one where, again, if we've got a nice, diverse, healthy ecosystem, then we've got a lot of organisms that are kind of controlling the growth of pests and diseases. I mean, a great example is a ladybug. Right? Ladybugs are kind of notorious for eating other pests and things like that might damage crops. So again, if the ecosystem's not healthy, let's say all the ladybugs die, then you're going to have a lot more of those pests that survive, right? But a healthy ecosystem will be able to control itself because you'll have a variety of those types of organisms that can keep those pests in check. I mean, imagine if there were no ladybugs, then what would we have to do? We'd have to go spend thousands and thousands of dollars on purchasing chemicals to control these pests. But if we've got the ladybug just kind of in its natural environment doing what it's supposed to do, then we don't really have to worry about spending all that money on pest control. But a lot of times we have to do that if our ecosystems become less biodiverse. The last couple slides here are about the final service called a supporting service. Supporting services are kind of, I guess, maybe the most important ones of all, I guess, because they kind of provide a service to allow all the other services to exist. A really important one, I guess, is a habitat. All the biological control we just talked about and the pollinators and all that stuff. If they didn't have a habitat, then none of that stuff would be even be a point that we would talk about because they wouldn't be existing. So habitats are pretty important. I mean, this is kind of the one big thing that a healthy ecosystem provides is just areas where these organisms can live. And finally, maintenance of genetic diversity. Again, if you have a healthy ecosystem, then that ecosystem will have a lot of genetic variety. Um, if it's not healthy, or if humans are tearing it down, then the level of genetic diversity lowers, right? And that's not very good for a species or for individuals. This map here is showing us what we call biodiversity hotspots. These are areas in red that are kind of notorious for having a very high number of species that live in those areas. These are of really great concern to scientists because this is where most of the biodiversity of our planet exists. I'll give a couple examples, like for example, the Amazon rainforest down here in South America, Madagascar, these islands off the coast of Africa, Southeast Asia. These are mainly all tropical regions where you find a lot of tropical rainforests. But these are areas that are more biodiverse than any other areas on our planet. And we are in danger of losing a lot of these places due to a lot of anthropogenic activity. So, if humans continue doing what they're doing, a lot of these areas may not exist down the road. And that would really take a huge, um, or have a huge impact on our global biodiversity. So just kind of be familiar with these regions. I'm not saying you have to know exact every spot, but in general, it's kind of around the equator, around that tropical region is where you find most of these hotspots. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Again, if you need to rewatch the video, feel free. I'll see you guys soon. Take care.